past February, Russia staged large forces close to the Ukrainian border, but the international community didn't suspect anything more than a military demonstration. The Beijing Winter Olympic Games were going on at the time, so the world thought Russia wouldn't do anything that could put China in a tough spot. But the United States, after its intelligence operations, warned the world of the high possibility of a Russian invasion. President Biden even announced that the Russian forces will cross the Belarusian border and invade Ukraine on February 16th. Although Biden didn't get the date right, Russia invaded the eastern Ukraine on February 22nd, 2 days after the conclusion of the Beijing Olympics. And on February 24th, 2 days after the invasion, Russia began a full-scale war, but called it a special military operation. When Russia began its invasion of Ukraine, many predicted that the war will soon be over. But contrary to the prediction, the war has been dragging on for a long time. Russia is stuck in Ukraine, but it isn't something that can be ended hastily. For Russia, it is a war it must win, and when its initial invasion turned into a defensive operation, Putin pulled out two of the worst cards: mobilization and nuclear weapons. But both options can lead to the demise of Russia. On the 21st of the last month, Putin announced the first ever mobilization since World War II and mentioned the use of nuclear weapons. Since then, social disorder has been continuing and the attempt to escape Russia is rampant. As an example, the border between Russia and Georgia is congested with vehicles trying to leave the country. Some people even abandoned their cars and fled on foot due to the overwhelming traffic of vehicles. Also, adding to the chaos, protests are continuing all over Russia. Soon after the announcement of the mobilization, recruiting stations and government buildings were targeted by protesters and set on fire or attacked. Russian police are using force to arrest the protesters, including teenagers. If what Putin said at the beginning of the war was correct, the mobilization should have never happened. He called the invasion of Ukraine a special military operation, not a war. Mobilization can only occur during a war, but Putin purposely didn't call it a war to avoid possible protests that usually accompany the announcement of war. But conducting a military operation and a war are two very different things. The Russian people didn't expect mobilization because they were told that it wasn't a war, but they were lied to. What's happening in Russia is very similar to what Nazi Germany did during the Second World War. Hitler had what was called Hitler Youth, consisted of teenagers up to the age of 18. In the early days of the Nazi Party, they conducted evening classes to study or conduct public agitation activities. Later, when the war broke out, they were used to deliver mobilization letters or assign simple physical labors. But later, when the war intensified, the females from the Hitler Youth were tasked to work at the military hospitals to care for the wounded, and the males were called to collect scrap metals or to build military facilities, such as bomb shelters. But they weren't called to participate in combat. But when the defeat of Nazi Germany became more and more apparent, the Nazis used Hitler Youths to fight on the Eastern Front. These were young males between the ages of 17 and 18. But at the end of World War II, boys over 13 were drafted to fight as combatants on both the Western and Eastern fronts. The Nazis forced people 18 and under to join the military. So what started as facet Boy Scouts eventually turned into military conscripts and were forced to fight in combat and risk their lives. Near the end of the war, Hitler announces that all Germans are now combatants, and any people who tried to avoid going to combat were executed. Everyone from children to the elderly was drafted and forced into combat, and Hitler wasn't hesitant to use his bodyguards to carry out executions for those who resisted. Also adding to the suffering of those who were forced into combat was the lack of training and experience to survive combat, and the lack of combat supplies didn't even allow enough weapons to go around to each soldier. So, those forced into combat were basically there to be human sandbags. Thousands of young men died in vain just because of what Hitler said. Present-day Russia greatly resembles the Nazi Germany of the past. Putin said in February that there won't be any mobilization, calling it a special military operation. Even worse, Russia isn't even winning, so it is very unlikely that those mobilized will change the current faith of the war. Once the mobilized soldiers are used up, Putin doesn't have any other choice but to conduct a full mobilization. Considering how everything Putin has said about the war proven to be lies, a full mobilization is very likely. It is like how Hitler forced everyone into the war at the end, from children to the elderly. Even how Hitler executed the people who resisted the draft closely resembles the present-day Russia. Russia is increasing the degree of punishment for those who resist the mobilization by sending them to prison. Based on what the Russian Senate approved, the soldiers who AWOL during mobilization will be imprisoned for up to 10 years rather than 5, which was the case prior to this mobilization. Increased punishment is enforced, especially for those who refuse to go into combat or cause insubordination. Adding to the current grim condition, Russia has formed barrier troops. The advertised mission of the barrier troops is to watch the battle and encourage the troops, but historically their primary task were to prevent soldiers from abandoning posts, even if that meant preventing them by shooting them down. For example, the Soviet barrier troops opened fire against its own soldiers who were retreating from German troops. An accurate record isn't available for exactly how many soldiers were killed by the barrier troops, but it is estimated to be around 158,000 soldiers. Russia also has barrier troops in service, based on a wire trap conducted by the Ukrainian intelligence agency. According to the wire trap, transmissions between Russian forces are full of words such as chaos and refusal to go into combat. And now that Ukraine is on the offensive, troops have retreated out of reach of Ukraine's range of fire. So Russia is using the barrier troops to prevent troops from abandoning their posts. One of the wire traps caught one Russian commander saying that retreating troops will be executed. This paints a picture of how Russia can't sustain its military efforts. The rage of the Russian people will only intensify after the mobilization, which is forcing them into a losing war. The anger will be pointed towards Putin, leading to his political demise. The families of the soldiers who were mobilized are already full of resentment and anger, and if Russia cannot turn the war around, even after the mobilization, Russian people will start to fear the possibility of full mobilization. Everyone will think that he or she may be forced into combat. If that tension builds, all the anger will be poured out on the current administration, possibly via a coup. As the possibility of losing the war becomes more likely, some are predicting the possibility of the dissolution of the Russian Federation. In fact, Russia's influence on neighboring countries is diminishing rapidly. First, since 1991, the Kremlin has pressured the West to acknowledge its exclusive influence over the old Soviet countries. This stance has been the baseline of the diplomatic efforts of Russia. With the massive army it inherited from the Soviet Union, Russia has pressured neighboring countries to be part of its national security plan. But such diplomatic efforts have crumbled due to the war in Ukraine. Russia wanted to restore its imperialistic influence through the war, but it is losing to Ukraine. Russia's place as one of the world powers and the superiority of its military has proven false. This has led to Russia's decreased influence over the countries that were part of the Soviet Union. This was evident from the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. These two prior Soviet countries have been in opposition for a long time due to the difference in religion and ethnicity. This conflict between two neighboring countries has led to numerous fatal incidents. So, to stop such conflicts, Russia has stationed 2,000 troops in Armenia, resulting in an armistice between the two. But now the situation has changed, since Russia has pulled out those troops to support its efforts in Ukraine. Now Russia is in a defensive position due to Ukraine's counterattack, and it had to pull out those 2,000 soldiers from Armenia to support its war efforts. Russia doesn't have military presence to mitigate the conflict between the two countries. It is not a coincidence that another armed conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan occurred recently, while Russia was preoccupied in Ukraine. As a result, Armenia is no longer able to rely on Russia. Although Armenia considered Russia a strategic ally for many years in the past, it is now skeptical critical whether Russia can ensure the safety and security of Armenia from Azerbaijan. It is important to note that how so many Armenians enthusiastically welcomed Nancy Pelosi with American flags when she visited the capital city of Armenia, Yerevan, on September 18th. Such events show that Armenia began to distance itself from Russia along with Azerbaijan, who wasn't friendly towards Russia to begin with. Russia's influence in the region is disappearing. It is even possible that Georgia breaks out in revolt. In 2008, Russia and Georgia had a war over South Ossetia, the so-called Russo-Georgian War. Russia invaded Georgia to support pro-Russia separatists living in South Ossetia, which was part of the Georgian territory, and it closely resembles the Ukrainian war. As a result, Georgia had to give up South Ossetia, and Russia declared it an independent state. Georgia suddenly lost its part of the territory and tried to take revenge on Russia for the past 15 years. In fact, the largest foreign supporting troops for Ukraine are the Georgian troops, which implies its extreme anger towards Russia. Therefore, the countries under the unofficial Russian Empire in the last 30 years are now turning their backs on Russia and finding their own ways to defend their countries. Ukraine and Moldova are now being influenced by Western countries, and Azerbaijan is trying to strengthen its strategic alliances with Turkey. Also, other countries, including Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, are putting efforts to reinforce relationships with China. Consequently, Putin's failure in the invasion of Ukraine triggered the possibility of rapid collapse of its enormous influence over other countries for over a few hundred years. It is highly likely that Russia will have a rebellion within the country, and neighboring countries are trying to get away from Russia's influence. Therefore, for Putin, Russia must win the war both politically and militarily. However, it's hard to inflict Putin's will to the Russian troops fighting in the front line. It means Kremlin's will for the war is not getting to the troops. If Russia's defeat continues despite the mobilization order, Putin will think it's not possible to push the front line with his troops. This will make Putin consider other ways to directly deliver Kremlin's will to Ukraine, meaning that he will do it himself if the soldiers can't. In other words, he will seriously consider using nuclear weapons. Even the mobilization order was a gamble to Putin, but he played this card. Since he already began gambling, it is reasonable to think that he will also consider the use of nuclear weapons to end the war swiftly. It's most likely that Putin will not be hesitant to use nuclear weapons to achieve his goals. He recently warned about the nuclear attack and said, "If Russian territories get attacked, we will use all possible forces and means to protect Russia and our people." This is not a bluff. If the war is not in Russia's favor, Russia may use nuclear weapons and resolve the deadlock. Then, what are some of the ways Putin will use nuclear weapons? Several scenarios are possible, and the first is a demonstration launch. By launching nuclear weapons in uninhabited areas such as the Black Sea, Russia can demonstrate its seriousness and threaten the West to back off. At the end of World War II, scientists who participated in the Manhattan Project, which created the atomic bombs, suggested to launch it as a demonstration rather than dropping it directly on a Japanese city. They said it could convince the enemy to surrender without causing actual damage. However, US officials refused this suggestion, as the shocking effect of the atomic bomb cannot be demonstrated fully without causing actual damage. For the same reasons, Russia is most likely to reject a demonstrative launch. The second scenario is to use a tactical nuclear weapon. Bombing Ukrainian targets with tactical nuclear weapons will shock the West, as well as destroying Ukraine's will to fight by severely destroying the people and supplies needed to continue the fight. This is the most likely scenario, since the effect of tactical nukes is relatively low compared to regular nuclear weapons. Also, the explosive power of most US and Russia's nuclear warheads are between 100 kiloton and 1,000 kiloton. The nuclear bomb dropped on Hiroshima was 15 kiloton. Russia may use a small warhead, smaller than the one dropped on Hiroshima, mounted on a cruise missile missile or Iskander missile. This way, Russia can avoid being called the country who used the largest nuclear weapon in history. While delivering a message to the West, Russia will terrify everyone while forcing its will to the West and Ukraine. The third scenario is using a regular nuclear weapon, a nuke between 50 to 100 kilotons, which is 3 to 6 times more powerful than the one used on Hiroshima. Ultimately, hundreds of thousands of people will die, and the damage created by the nuclear fallout will be unmeasurable. If this type of nuclear weapon is dropped on Ukraine's capital Kiev, the leadership and officials of Ukraine will be destroyed. This will ensure Russia's immediate win against Ukraine. However, if a regular nuclear weapon is used, the United States and NATO will respond immediately, and they have powerful conventional weapons as well as nuclear weapons, so they will destroy Russian forces in Ukraine as well as the leadership in Russia. Even if Russia wins the war in Ukraine with nuclear weapon, it will be defeated by the West immediately afterwards, so using anything more than a tactical nuclear weapon will be a very hard decision for Putin. The fourth scenario is a nuclear attack on NATO. This is the least likely option, which is attacking Central Europe with a long-range missile or air-launched cruise missile. And if Russia decides to go with this option, it is likely to use something bigger than a tactical nuke to threaten Europe. Such severe destruction, not seen since World War II, will trigger a nuclear response from one of the NATO allies. Then World War III will ensue. But it is also very possible that Putin will not play the nuclear weapons card. Even China may deter Russia from using tactical nukes. China has a doctrine that restrains the preemptive use of nuclear weapons, so Russia's use of nuclear weapons will cut off all support from China if Russia decides to use nukes first. Russia depends heavily on China's political and economic support, so it will be completely cut off from the rest of the world if it loses China's support. If Putin ever uses nuclear weapons, Russia will lose China. Upon Russia's recent threat of using nuclear weapons, US gave firm warning against the use of it. President Biden warned that if Russia uses nuclear weapons, the war will be very different than all the wars since World War II. The consequences will be severe, but it is difficult to predict what the US and NATO will do after the use of nuclear weapons. The US can react immediately with counter-use of nuclear weapon, but it will also refrain from the use of nuclear weapons to prevent the situation from worsening or to prevent an all-out nuclear war. But what Russia really wants is for US to not react for the fear of all-out nuclear war. If so, Russia can win the war in Ukraine and leave a precedent that nothing happens even if Russia uses nuclear weapons. That will leave nuclear weapons an option for Russia in future conflicts. It will give Russia almost a free pass to the use of nuclear weapons, so the US doesn't have a choice but to take action if Russia does decide to use nuclear weapons. The US must respond, and if it doesn't, it will immediately lose its place as the world power. And the world is watching how the US will respond to Russia's use of nuclear weapons if Russia ever decides to do so. The countries with nuclear weapons are especially watching closely, such as China, North Korea, Iran, and Pakistan. If the US doesn't respond to Russia's use of nuclear weapons, there will be a possibility that other countries will also use nuclear weapons against their adversaries, such as North Korea against the South, China against Taiwan, and Iran against Saudi Arabia. If this happens, the US must extend its front lines all over Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. Therefore, the US cannot let Russia's use of nuclear weapons pass when the possibility of other uses of nuclear weapons exists. Once Russia launches a nuclear weapon, the problem becomes much more than what's going on in Ukraine, and that's why Biden seriously warned against the use of it. Russia knows very well that the US will get involved if it decides to use nuclear weapons, and one thing Russia wants to avoid is going against the US. If the US gets involved, it is obvious that Russia will lose, and even if Putin is willing to risk going against the US, his subordinates may not. So, if Putin tries to use nuclear weapons, Putin's subordinates in Kremlin may take him out before he can do that. Daily Express, a UK media, wrote that if Putin tries tries to use nuclear weapons, he may be assassinated by his subordinates in Kremlin. Considering that Putin already made numerous mistakes since the invasion of Ukraine, his subordinates in Kremlin may already be full of resentment. Putin underestimated the possible resistance from the people of Ukraine, and he also thought NATO will submit under Russia's threat of cutting off natural gas. Then Putin ordered mobilization, which led to the worst political situation. The fact that Putin is repeatedly making bad decisions depicts how he is isolated from reality. It is a well-known fact that people in the Kremlin are afraid to tell Putin the truth. The situation developing in Russia is a time bomb. There's no guarantee that others in the Kremlin will continue to follow Putin's orders. If Putin decides to use nuclear weapons, all resentment against him may lead to his assassination. Amid Ukraine winning the war and pushing the front line, Putin pulled out two cards: mobilization and nuclear weapons. The mobilization order is causing internal resentment, and the use of nuclear weapons is causing external pressure. So Putin is slowly getting into a deep hole. So it's important to keep paying attention to what effect the mobilized soldiers will have in Ukraine and on whether Putin will use nuclear weapons. Please leave your thoughts in the comment section below. See you in the next video.